you live as if there is a God. Is that correct?
Well, people ask me if I believe in God. You know, I'm going to release a podcast about that, because I answered that question for about 2 hours in Australia, because people kept asking me that question, which I really don't like. I don't like that question. And so I sat and thought about it for a good while, and I tried to figure out why. And then I thought, well, you believe. I thought, who would have the audacity to claim that they believed in God if they examined the way they lived? Who would dare say that? To believe, you think, to believe in a Christian sense, to actually, this is why Nietzsche said there was only ever one Christian, and that was Christ. To have the audacity to claim that means that you live it out fully. And that's an unbearable task in some sense. I just debated Slavoj Žižek about a week ago, although it wasn't really much of a debate. It was a strange event. But he said something very brilliant, and to me that justified the entire event, at least from my perspective. He talked about Christ's moment of crisis on the cross when he cried out to God that he had been forsaken. And what Žižek said was that what that meant was that the conditions of human existence are so tragic that even God himself in human form lost faith for a moment in the goodness of being. And I thought that was a remarkable observation because, well, if God himself would lose faith under such conditions, what would you expect from normal human beings confronted with what we're confronted by? And to be able to accept the structure of existence, the suffering that goes along with it, and the disappointment and the betrayal, and to nonetheless act properly, right? To aim at the good with all your heart, right? To dispense with the malevolence and your desire for destruction and revenge and all of that, and to face things courageously and to tell the truth, to speak the truth and to act it out. That's what it means to believe. That's what it means. It doesn't mean to state it. It means to act it out. And unless you act it out, you should be very careful about claiming it. And so I've never been comfortable saying anything other than I try to act as if God exists, because God only knows what you'd be if you truly believed. I mean, if you think about it in some sense, that's the central idea in Christianity, is that if you were capable of believing, it would be a transfiguring event, a truly transfiguring event. And I know people experience that to one degree or another, but we have no idea what the limit of that is. And we have no idea what the possibility is within each person if they lived a life that was maximally courageous and maximally truthful. You know, because maybe you're running at 60% or 70% or 20% and at cross purposes to yourself. God only knows what you'd be if you believed. And so, well, I try to act like I believe, but I'd never claim that I manage it, because it's a lot to manage properly. And you have to be careful about claiming to manage things that you can't manage. And so that's part of the answer to that question.
It's a great answer, as it happens. I'd like you to react to something that is very operative in my life. I always tell people on my radio show, and totally feel free to say, sorry, I really don't find that tenable, or however you want to react. My route as an adult to God has been completely circuitous. I have come through the back door. As I wrote 25 years ago, How I Found God at Columbia, I realized in the 70s at graduate school at Columbia that I was being taught nonsense, literally nonsense, things that made no sense. And it drove me crazy because they were all bright. Bright people taught me nonsense. One day, walking through Columbia, the only time I ever had, I wouldn't say I never had a theophany, but I did have an epiphany. All of a sudden, one of the verses from my yeshiva education in Brooklyn, New York, the cloistered Orthodox world of my childhood, and I don't use cloistered, and I don't like cloistered, but I'm not using it in a pejorative way. I'm just explaining what I had. And all of a sudden, one of the verses that we said every morning in kindergarten, first grade, and second grade, for the first time since second grade, came to my brain. Reshit Chachma Yirat Adonai. Wisdom begins with fear of the Lord. Changed my life. There's no wisdom at Columbia because there's no God at Columbia. And that is one of the ways I knew, oh, without God, look what happens. Without God, look what happens morally, intellectually, in terms of wisdom. And my biggest reasons for belief in God are watching what happens when people don't. So I'd love to have your reaction.
Is it C.S. Lewis? Was it C.S. Lewis who said that if you cease to believe in God, you'll start to believe in anything?
That was the British guy.
Chesterton.
Yeah, Chesterton.
Thank you.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's a good way of looking at it. I mean, if Catholicism, I've gone through lots of Catholic cathedrals in Europe, and of course they're stunning creations, but they're Gothic and strange, and the doctrine is eerie and complex and surreal, and the biblical writings are the same. You think of a book like Revelation, for example. But I think that the Catholicism, that's as sane as people can get. Broadly speaking, is that we need a metaphysic, a narrative metaphysic to hold us together. And it has to be predicated on something that's transcendent and absolute. And if you lose that, then you'll fall for something else. You'll fall for something else. Or you'll fall for nothing, which is no better. And I learned that from reading Nietzsche, and I learned that from reading Dostoevsky. And this is the problem with the rationalists like Sam Harris and the atheists, Dawkins. They believe that if we dispensed with our superstitions, we'd all become Harris and Dawkins. Rational beings devoted towards the good, however we conceptualize that for rational reasons. And I don't believe that, because I don't believe that we are rational beings fundamentally. I think we're deeply irrational. It's amazing that we can all sit in this room together without tearing ourselves into shreds. And I mean that. It's really quite a remarkable thing that all of us who've come from all over North America can sit here so peacefully and concentrate on a single thing without any tension or trouble. The improbability of that should not be underestimated. The unlikelihood that might be the case. And then the issue of God as well is that there has to be something of fundamental worth. There is something that you consider of fundamental worth. I think that regard for other people, for the consciousness of other people, for the conscious being of other people, is in that realm. If you're going to have a relationship with yourself, if you're going to be able to love someone else, if you're going to be able to take care of your family and your community, you have to attribute to human beings a value that might as well be described as divine, given that it has to be the ultimate value that you hold. And it seems to me that it's not unreasonable to associate that value that is intrinsic in humanity with something that's metaphysically real, that's part of the structure of reality itself. And my sense has been that it makes, if you watch how people act when they're acting properly, the hypothesis that there is divinity within us that reflects divinity itself is the only conclusion that makes sense, that works. And so I think the evidence suggests that. You know, you said, you look what happens when societies lose their bearings. It's like, yeah, that's what convinced me. To the degree that I became a religious person, wasn't as if I discovered God. It was more like I discovered Satan or discovered the devil, and certainly believed that very powerfully, metaphysically or not. You don't have to read that much about what happened in Nazi Germany or what happened in the Soviet Union or what happened in Maoist China, what continues to happen in many places around the world, to be convinced that there's a great darkness. And it seems to me that if there's a great darkness, then there has to be a great light. And the first part of that is true beyond any hope of refutation. And the second seems to be a logical necessity in the light of the first.
It's a powerful line that you did. I feel so obviously the same. I want to talk to you about the darkness. So I've often said, all of my life really, that we have a wrong metaphor in calling evil dark, because it's actually so bright that people can't stare it in the face. The number of Canadian or American students at the most prestigious universities who could identify Pol Pot or even the Gulag Archipelago, let alone the Great Leap Forward in China, is so small. The knowledge of evil, it is now up to over a quarter of kids never heard of Auschwitz. It'll be a half very soon. It will be 3/4 in a generation. They don't know evil. At Berkeley, I had a dialogue with 2 leftist students. My last question to them was, do you believe people are basically good? And they said yes. And I said, it's so demonstrably wrong, that belief, that there's only one possible explanation for why you hold it, because you live in such a good country.
Yeah, well, that's the goodness of naivety, right? And it's something that's encouraged. You know, you encourage that by producing safe spaces around people. You produce that by sheltering them. You want to preserve that childlike innocence, but once you're no longer a child, it's not childlike, it's just childish. And that's not good, to be a 40-year-old child and to think that people are fundamentally good. It's not that. Good is very difficult. It's by no means the default position. What's the default position? Entropy, catastrophe, tragedy, malevolence, and death. That's the default position. The good struggles up against that. That's no easy thing to manage. To think of that as intrinsic. It's an intrinsic possibility, but it's not something that you can manifest without faith and commitment. And the more faith and the more commitment, the better. And the deeper, the better. And it's the most difficult of things to do. And it's appalling to teach people the alternative. And I know that